My name is Isabella and I am 23 years old. 3 months ago, I discovered something that shattered everything I believed about family loyalty. When my stepdad Marcus refused to help pay for my emergency surgery and told me I was not worth keeping alive, I thought that was the worst betrayal possible. But what my mother did next made his cruelty look like child's play. The truth about why he really married her 15 years ago would destroy our entire family dynamic forever, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. Before we dive into this family revenge story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you are ready to see how karma came for the man who tried to let me die, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this tale of family vengeance will leave you speechless. Trust me, you will want to stick around for every twist and turn. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was a Tuesday morning in September when I collapsed at my college campus. The pain in my abdomen was unlike anything I had ever experienced, like someone was twisting a knife inside me while setting my organs on fire. My roommate Sarah found me on the bathroom floor, barely conscious and burning with fever. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and concerned voices. When I finally came to in the emergency room, the doctor's face was grave. I had a severely infected appendix that had nearly ruptured, and they needed to operate immediately. Without surgery, I could develop sepsis and die within hours. The problem was my insurance had lapsed because I had aged out of my mother's policy, and I had been too focused on my senior year to get my own coverage yet. The surgery would cost nearly $30,000 money I absolutely did not have as a struggling college student working part-time at a coffee shop. My savings account had maybe $800, barely enough to cover textbooks for the semester. Panic set in as I realized I might actually die because I could not afford to live. Through my pain medication haze, I called my mother, Patricia, first. She had remarried Marcus when I was 8 years old, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, I thought she would move heaven and earth to save my life. Her voice was shaky when she answered, and I could hear Marcus in the background asking who was calling. "Mom, I need help," I whispered into the phone, explaining my situation through tears and medication fog. "The doctors say, if I do not have this surgery tonight, I could die. Please, I need $30,000 for the operation." There was a long pause, then muffled conversation. I could hear Marcus's voice getting louder and angrier, though I could not make out the exact words. Finally, my mother came back on the line, her voice different, somehow distant and cold in a way I had never heard before. "Isabella, honey, that is a lot of money. Let me talk to Marcus and see what we can figure out. I will call you back in an hour." That hour felt like an eternity. I watched the clock on the hospital wall tick by while nurses checked my vitals and doctors explained the urgency of my situation. My fever was climbing and they were running out of time to operate safely. When my phone finally rang, I grabbed it desperately. But it was not my mother calling back. It was Marcus. His voice was cold and calculating, nothing like the man who had pretended to care about me for 15 years. "Isabella, I have been thinking about your situation and I need to be honest with you. $30,000 is a significant amount of money, and frankly, I do not see it as a wise investment." "Investment?" He called my life an investment. "What are you saying?" I managed to whisper, though deep down I already knew. "I am saying that you are not worth keeping alive. You have been nothing but a financial burden on this family since your mother and I got married. You eat our food, live under our roof when you are home from college, and now you want us to pay for expensive medical procedures. I think it is time you learned about personal responsibility." The words hit me like a physical blow. This man who had walked me down the aisle at my high school graduation, who had taught me how to drive, who had been the only father figure I had ever known, was essentially telling me to die because I was not worth the money. "Marcus, please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I am your stepdaughter. I thought you loved me." He laughed, actually laughed, a sound so cruel it made my blood run cold. "Love does not pay bills, Isabella. Your mother and I have our own future to think about. We are planning some major life changes, and we cannot afford to throw away money on someone who has never contributed anything meaningful to this family." "Where is my mother?" I demanded. "I want to talk to her. She is standing right here," and she agrees with me completely. In fact, this whole conversation was her idea. She wanted me to be the one to tell you because she thought it would be easier coming from me. Apparently, she was wrong about that too. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating that for a moment I could not breathe. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, who raised me, who I thought would die before letting harm come to me, had decided I was not worth saving. She had sent her husband to deliver the death sentence because she did not even have the courage to do it herself. I see. I whispered, my voice completely flat now. The emotion was draining out of me, replaced by something much colder and infinitely more dangerous. Thank you for clarifying where I stand in this family. I am glad you understand, Marcus said, his tone suggesting he thought this conversation was over. Now I suggest you call some friends or maybe start a fundraising page online. People love sob stories these days. He hung up without another word, leaving me alone in that hospital bed with the knowledge that the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just sentenced me to death over money they could afford to spend. I knew they had money because Marcus owned a successful construction company and my mother worked as a real estate agent in one of the wealthiest areas of our city. They drove luxury cars and took expensive vacations every year. But somehow my life was not worth $30,000 to them. As I lay there processing this betrayal, something interesting happened. Instead of falling apart completely, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. The fog of pain medication and emotional shock cleared, and I began to think very strategically about my situation. They wanted to play hardball, fine. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. I had always been the quiet, obedient daughter who never caused trouble. I got good grades, stayed out of drama, and never asked for anything unreasonable. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my love for them as unconditional acceptance of whatever treatment they decided to dish out. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first call I made after Marcus hung up on me was not to beg for money or cry to friends about my situation. Instead, I called the hospital's financial aid office and social services. Within 2 hours, I had managed to qualify for emergency assistance that would cover most of my surgery costs, with the remaining balance arranged through a payment plan I could actually manage. It turned out that when you are facing a life-threatening emergency with no family support, the system has ways to help you that Marcus and my mother either did not know about or had chosen not to mention. The surgery went smoothly, and I spent the next 3 days recovering in the hospital with plenty of time to think. Sarah brought me my laptop and I began doing research that would change everything. If my family wanted to treat me like I was nothing to them, I was going to find out exactly what I meant to them financially and legally. What I discovered during those long hospital hours was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. First, I learned that my mother had been lying to me about our family's financial situation for years. Through public records searches, I found that she and Marcus owned not just their primary home but 3 rental properties and a vacation house in the mountains. Their combined income was well over $200,000 annually, making my $30,000 medical emergency less than they spent on their last European vacation. But that was just the beginning. Digging deeper into property records and business filings, I discovered something that made my blood boil. When my biological father died in a car accident when I was 5 years old, he had left behind a substantial life insurance policy and a trust fund specifically designated for my education and medical expenses. The trust was supposed to be managed by my mother until I turned 25, at which point I would gain full access to the remaining funds. According to the original trust documents I found through the county clerk's office, that trust had started with over $400,000 18 years ago. By now, with proper investment and compound interest, it should have been worth well over $700,000. More than enough to cover any medical emergency I might face, and certainly enough to pay for my remaining college expenses and set me up for a good start in adult life. But when I accessed the trust account online using information from the original paperwork, I discovered the balance was only $43,000. Someone had been systematically draining my inheritance for years, and I had a pretty good idea who. The more I dug, the more the picture became clear. Marcus had not married my mother for love 15 years ago. He had married her for access to my trust fund, and they had been using my father's money to fund their lavish lifestyle, while telling me we needed to be careful about expenses. Every vacation they took, every luxury car they bought, every expensive dinner they enjoyed, had been paid for with money that was meant to secure my future. They had stolen from me for over a decade, and when I actually needed the money for its intended purpose, they had told me I was not worth keeping alive. But the most damning discovery came when I found email records through my mother's old account that I still had access to from high school. There were messages between her and Marcus from just 2 months ago, discussing their plans to drain the rest of my trust fund to buy a fourth rental property. In one particularly revealing exchange, Marcus wrote that they needed to move quickly because I would gain full access to the account in 2 years, and they wanted to make sure there was as little left as possible for me to discover. My mother had responded that she felt guilty about taking my inheritance, but Marcus had convinced her that I would never amount to anything anyway, so the money was better invested in their retirement portfolio. She actually wrote that I was not the investment type, and that they were doing me a favor by handling the money responsibly. Reading those emails while recovering from surgery they had refused to pay for was like being stabbed all over again. But this time, instead of crying, I started planning. I realized I had been approaching this situation all wrong. This was not just about $30,000 for medical treatment. This was about nearly $700,000 that had been systematically stolen from me over more than a decade. This was about 2 people who had pretended to love me while planning to leave me with nothing. This was about a man who had married my mother specifically to get access to money that belonged to me, and a mother who had chosen financial gain over her daughter's welfare. They wanted to play the money game. Fine. I was about to show them what happened when you steal from someone who has nothing left to lose. My first call was to a lawyer who specialized in trust fund disputes. When I explained my situation and forwarded him copies of all the evidence I had gathered, his reaction was immediate and intense. What Marcus and my mother had done was not just morally wrong, it was legally theft on a massive scale. He was confident we could not only recover every penny they had stolen, but also pursue criminal charges and additional damages for breach of fiduciary duty. My second call was to a private investigator who came highly recommended for financial fraud cases. If Marcus and my mother thought they had been clever about hiding their theft, they were about to learn otherwise. I wanted every transaction tracked, every dollar accounted for, and every lie they had told documented with evidence that would hold up in court. The private investigator was particularly interested when I mentioned Marcus's construction company. Financial fraud in business often involves tax evasion and other federal crimes that could result in serious prison time, not just civil penalties. If Marcus had been using my trust money to fund business expenses while claiming different sources of income for tax purposes, we might be looking at a much bigger case than simple theft. But I was not interested in just getting my money back. Money could be recovered, but the emotional damage they had caused was something else entirely. They had looked me in the eye and told me I was not worth keeping alive. They had let me believe I might die alone and abandoned while they sat on hundreds of thousands of dollars that rightfully belonged to me. For that level of betrayal, I wanted more than financial compensation. I wanted complete and utter destruction of everything they had built on my stolen inheritance. I wanted them to lose not just money, but their reputation, their social standing, their sense of security, and their ability to ever hurt anyone the way they had hurt me. They had taught me a valuable lesson about what family really means when money is involved. Now I was going to teach them a lesson about what happens when you underestimate someone you have decided is worthless. The war they started when they told me to die was about to become very real, and I intended to be the only one left standing when the smoke cleared. Recovering from surgery gave me the perfect cover for what I was actually doing. While Marcus and my mother assumed I was lying around feeling sorry for myself, I was building the most comprehensive case of financial fraud and theft they would ever face. What they did not realize was that my college major was forensic accounting, and I had spent 4 years learning exactly how to trace financial crimes and build bulletproof evidence trails. The private investigator I hired, Daniel Martinez, was a former FBI financial crimes specialist who had seen cases like mine before, but he told me the scope of what Marcus and my mother had done was particularly egregious. Most trust fund theft happened gradually over time, with some attempt at plausible justification. What my family had done was systematic looting, with a clear intent to leave me with nothing. Within 2 weeks of starting our investigation, Daniel had uncovered financial records that painted a disturbing picture of calculated theft spanning over a decade. Marcus had not just been taking money from my trust fund randomly. He had been strategically timing withdrawals to coincide with major purchases, then creating false documentation to make it appear the money had come from legitimate business income, or my mother's real estate commissions. The vacation house in the mountains, bought entirely with my trust money, then put in Marcus's name only. The 3 rental properties, down payments, all came from my inheritance, but the deeds listed Marcus and my mother as the sole owners, meaning I had no legal claim to properties I had essentially purchased. Even their luxury cars had been bought with money my father had left to ensure my future security. But Daniel's most shocking discovery came when he traced the financial records of Marcus's construction company. It turned out that Marcus had been using my trust fund as an unofficial business loan system, withdrawing large amounts when he needed cash flow for projects, then sometimes paying it back and sometimes not, depending on how profitable each job turned out to be. He had basically turned my inheritance into his personal line of credit, except unlike a real loan, he never paid interest and had no legal obligation to repay anything. The total amount stolen was even worse than I had initially calculated. With compound interest and investment returns that should have been reinvested in the trust, they had taken nearly $800,000 from me over 15 years. $800,000. That should have guaranteed I would never have to worry about medical bills or college expenses, or starting my adult life with financial security. While Daniel worked on tracing every stolen dollar, I focused on gathering evidence of the emotional and psychological damage they had caused. I recorded phone calls where my mother continued to justify their decision not to help with my medical bills, claiming they simply could not afford it, while I knew they were sitting on properties worth over $2 million. I documented text messages where Marcus made snide comments about my entitlement, and suggested I should be grateful they had provided me with food and shelter growing up, conveniently forgetting that they had been using my money to pay for those necessities. But the real breakthrough came when I reached out to other people who had been affected by Marcus's business practices. If he was willing to steal from his own stepdaughter, I reasoned he was probably cutting corners and cheating clients as well. What I discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond what he had done to me. Through social media and online review sites, I found 3 former employees who had been fired after asking questions about discrepancies in project budgets. All 3 were willing to speak with Daniel and provide evidence that Marcus had been systematically overcharging clients using substandard materials, while billing for premium products and falsifying inspection reports to hide shoddy time service. 5. Workmanship. One former employee, Jennifer Walsh, had been Marcus's office manager for 6 years before she was abruptly fired for insubordination. What she had actually done was discover that Marcus was running 2 sets of books, one for tax purposes and one that showed his real income. She had kept copies of financial records that proved Marcus had been underreporting his business income to avoid taxes, while simultaneously inflating his reported income on loan applications to qualify for better interest rates on the quote, properties he had bought with my money. Jennifer was particularly angry because Marcus had fired her just 2 weeks before Christmas, claiming the business was struggling financially, while she knew he had just taken a $50,000 draw from my trust fund to buy my mother a new Mercedes for her birthday. She had been looking for a way to expose him ever since, and my case gave her the perfect opportunity. The second former employee, Robert Chen, had been a project foreman who was fired after refusing to sign off on a building inspection he knew was fraudulent. Robert had documentation proving that Marcus had used substandard electrical wiring on a commercial project while charging the client for premium materials. When the client later discovered problems and threatened to sue, Marcus had blamed Robert and fired him to avoid taking responsibility. Robert still had photos and receipts that proved Marcus's deception, and he was eager to testify about the pattern of fraud he had witnessed. The third former employee was the most damaging witness of all. Susan Martinez had been Marcus's accountant for 8 years, and she had been forced to quit when she could no longer ignore the illegal financial practices she was being asked to facilitate. Susan had been told to create false invoices, manipulate tax documents, and hide income streams that Marcus did not want reported to the IRS. When she finally told Marcus she could not continue participating in tax fraud, he had threatened to destroy her reputation in the accounting community if she ever spoke about what she had seen. Susan was terrified of Marcus, but she was also tired of looking over her shoulder and worried that she could face criminal charges herself if the tax fraud was ever discovered and traced back to her work. She agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for immunity, and the evidence she provided was devastating. She had kept copies of everything because she knew Marcus would eventually try to blame her if his schemes were exposed. With Susan's evidence, we could prove that Marcus had not only stolen my trust fund money, but had been committing federal tax evasion for nearly a decade. The IRS takes a very dim view of people who hide income while simultaneously defrauding vulnerable family members, and the penalties for that level of financial crime included significant prison time, not just civil penalties. But I wanted more than just financial and legal consequences. I wanted everyone who knew Marcus and my mother to understand exactly who they really were underneath their respectable facade. I wanted their friends, neighbors, clients, and professional colleagues to know they were dealing with people who would steal from orphaned children and then tell those children they were not worth keeping alive. That meant I needed to control the narrative and the timing of how this information became public. A private legal settlement would get me my money back, but it would also allow them to continue pretending to be decent people. I did not want money and silence. I wanted money and complete public humiliation for both of them. So I began planning the most comprehensive public relations campaign of my life. I would hit them simultaneously on legal, financial, professional, and social fronts, making sure that when the truth came out, there would be no hiding from the consequences and no way for them to minimize or spin what they had done. The beautiful irony was that they had taught me everything I needed to know about their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. After 15 years of living in their house and observing their relationships and business practices, I knew exactly where to apply pressure for maximum damage. Marcus was particularly proud of his reputation in the construction industry and his standing in our local community. He served on the board of 2 charities and was a prominent member of the Rotary Club, positions that would become very uncomfortable when people learned he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his orphaned stepdaughter's trust fund. My mother was equally invested in her social image and professional reputation. As a real estate agent, she depended on referrals and community connections to maintain her client base. Learning that she had participated in stealing her daughter's inheritance while telling that daughter she was not worth saving would not exactly inspire confidence in her integrity or judgment. They had both built their entire adult lives on money that belonged to me, while simultaneously treating me like I was a burden they could not wait to get rid of. Now I was going to show them what it felt like to lose everything they thought they had earned, just like they had tried to do to me. The only difference was that, when I destroyed their lives, I would be doing it with evidence, legal authority, and justification they could never challenge. They had handed me every weapon I needed to completely annihilate them, and they had done it while convinced I was too weak and stupid to ever fight back. They could not have been more wrong about that, and they were about to find out exactly how much damage their worthless stepdaughter could do when she put her mind to it. The moment I had been preparing for arrived on a Wednesday morning in November, exactly 2 months after they had told me I was not worth keeping alive. I had spent those weeks carefully orchestrating every detail of their downfall, and now it was time to execute the plan that would destroy everything they had built on my stolen inheritance. My lawyer, Thomas Richardson, had filed all the necessary paperwork the previous Friday, but we had requested that the court documents be sealed until Wednesday morning to prevent Marcus and my mother from having advance warning. At exactly 9 a.m., When Marcus would be at his office and my mother would be showing houses to clients, multiple legal proceedings would begin simultaneously. The first surprise came when Marcus arrived at his construction company office to find federal agents executing a search warrant for all financial records related to tax evasion and trust fund theft. The IRS does not mess around when they have evidence of someone systematically hiding income while stealing from orphaned children, and Susan Martinez had provided them with enough documentation to justify seizing every computer file, cabinet, and financial document in the building. While Marcus was dealing with federal agents, my mother received an equally unpleasant surprise at the real estate office where she worked. A process server handed her a civil lawsuit seeking $800,000 in damages, plus interest penalties and legal fees that would likely double that amount. The lawsuit included a detailed accounting of every penny they had stolen from my trust fund, along with documentation of their refusal to help me pay for life-saving medical treatment while sitting on millions of dollars in assets, purchased with my money. But the legal proceedings were just the beginning. I had learned from watching Marcus operate that the most effective way to destroy someone was to attack their reputation and their income simultaneously. Criminal charges and civil lawsuits could take years to resolve, but social and professional consequences could happen immediately and permanently damage their ability to rebuild. While they were both reeling from the legal surprise attack, I executed the second phase of my plan. I had prepared detailed information packets documenting their theft and the circumstances around my medical emergency, complete with copies of trust fund records, property deeds, and the emails where my mother had discussed draining my inheritance. These packets were delivered simultaneously to Marcus's biggest construction clients, my mother's real estate broker, and every member of the boards and organizations where Marcus held leadership positions. The reaction was swift and devastating. Marcus's largest commercial client, a property development company that represented over 60% of his annual revenue, immediately suspended their contract pending investigation of the fraud allegations. They could not risk their own reputation by continuing to work with someone who had been accused of systematic financial crimes, especially when the evidence was so well documented. My mother's real estate broker was equally quick to distance the company from the scandal. While they could not immediately fire her without cause, they quietly reassigned all her active listings to other agents and made it clear that her contract would not be renewed when it expired in 3 months. In the real estate business, trust and reputation are everything, and no one wants to work with an agent who steals from her own children. The third phase of my plan targeted their social and community standing. I had created a detailed website documenting everything they had done to me, complete with copies of legal documents, financial records, and hospital bills from my surgery. The website was professionally designed and carefully written to stick to verifiable facts, while making the moral implications of their actions absolutely clear. I then systematically shared this website with every organization, charity, and social group they belonged to. Marcus was forced to resign from 2 charity boards within a week, when other board members made it clear they would not serve alongside someone who stole from orphaned children. His Rotary Club membership was quietly terminated after several prominent members threatened to leave if he remained. The fourth phase was perhaps the most personally satisfying, because it involved exposing their hypocrisy to everyone who had ever heard them criticize other people for their parenting or financial decisions. I had always hated listening to Marcus and my mother judge other families for what they perceived as poor choices or lack of responsibility when they were secretly funding their lifestyle with money stolen from a child. I created social media accounts specifically to respond to their public posts and comments with polite but devastating questions about their own choices. When Marcus posted on Facebook about the importance of teaching young people about financial responsibility, I responded with a link to the court documents showing he had stolen my college fund. When my mother shared an article about the importance of family support during medical emergencies, I replied with a copy of the hospital bill she had refused to help me pay. Their friends and social media followers were horrified as they realized what Marcus and my mother had actually done. The comments sections of their posts became battlegrounds where people demanded explanations and expressed outrage about their treatment of me. Within 2 weeks, both of them had deactivated their social media accounts entirely because they could not show their faces online without facing a barrage of criticism and moral condemnation. But the most effective element of my campaign was the way I had positioned myself throughout the entire process. I never attacked them emotionally or used inflammatory language. Everything I did was calm, factual, and focused on documented evidence rather than personal grievances. This made their inevitable attempts to portray me as a vindictive or unstable daughter completely ineffective. When Marcus tried to claim that I was exaggerating the medical emergency, or that they had been willing to help me find other financing options, I simply referred people to the hospital records showing the severity of my condition and the finance. Audio recordings of our phone conversations where he explicitly told me I was not worth keeping alive. There was no spin or interpretation that could make those facts look reasonable. When my mother attempted to justify their use of my trust fund by claiming they had been investing the money responsibly for my future benefit, I provided detailed accounting showing that they had spent it on luxury purchases and vacation, properties that were titled only in their names. The math was simple and damning, and no amount of rationalization could explain why my inheritance had been used to buy them a vacation house while I nearly died because I could not afford surgery. The strategy worked exactly as I had hoped. Within a month, Marcus had lost his biggest clients, faced federal tax evasion charges, and been forced to resign from every leadership position he held in the community. My mother had essentially lost her career in real estate and faced social ostracism from everyone who had considered her a friend. But more importantly, they had lost the ability to control the narrative about what kind of people they were. For 15 years, they had presented themselves as responsible, caring adults who had generously taken in an orphan child and provided her with a stable home. The truth was that they had systematically looted that child's inheritance while emotionally manipulating her into believing she should be grateful for their basic care. Now everyone knew who they really were, and there was no going back to their previous life of respected community members living comfortably on stolen money. They had taught me that family meant nothing when money was involved, so I had shown them exactly what it felt like to lose everything because of financial consequences. The beautiful irony was that every weapon I had used against them had been provided by their own actions and choices. I had not needed to lie, exaggerate, or manipulate anyone. I had simply documented what they had done and shared that information with people who had a right to know who they were really dealing with. They had sown the wind with their greed and cruelty, and now they were reaping the whirlwind of consequences they had earned through 15 years of systematic betrayal. The domino effect of their exposure was more dramatic than even I had anticipated. Within 6 weeks of my campaign going public, Marcus and my mother's entire life had collapsed in ways that seemed almost too poetic to be real. The house of cards they had built on my stolen inheritance was crumbling faster than they could manage the damage control. Marcus's construction business, which he had spent 20 years building, was completely destroyed within a month. The federal tax investigation had uncovered evidence of fraud that went far beyond what he had done to me. When the IRS started digging into his business practices with the evidence Susan Martinez had provided, they discovered he had been underreporting income, claiming false deductions and using subcontractor schemes to avoid paying proper taxes, for nearly a decade. The criminal charges were serious enough that Marcus was looking at potential federal prison time, but the immediate financial consequences were even more devastating. The IRS placed liens on all his assets, including the properties he had bought with my trust fund money, and froze his business accounts while they calculated the full extent of his tax debt. His construction company was forced to shut down immediately because he could not access operating capital or pay his workers. But the most satisfying part was watching his former clients and business partners distance themselves from him as quickly as possible. 3 different property owners filed lawsuits alleging that Marcus had used substandard materials while charging premium prices, exactly the kind of fraud Robert Chen had tried to expose before he was fired. These clients had been willing to overlook quality concerns, when Marcus was a respected businessman, but now that his reputation was destroyed, they wanted compensation for every corner he had cut and every lie he had told. My mother's downfall was equally swift, but more personally humiliating. The real estate industry runs on referrals and reputation, and once word spread about what she had done to me, her client base evaporated overnight. Nobody wants to trust their most important financial decisions to someone who steals from her own children, especially when that theft involved manipulating trust funds and letting a child nearly die to protect her own assets. Her broker officially terminated her contract 2 weeks earlier than expected after 3 of her former clients filed complaints with the State Real Estate Commission. These clients claimed that my mother had misrepresented her integrity and trustworthiness, and they wanted investigations into whether she had been equally dishonest in her professional dealings. The commission was taking these complaints seriously because the evidence of her personal financial crimes raised questions about her fitness to handle other people's money and property transactions. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for my mother was the way her social circle completely abandoned her. She had built her entire identity around being a pillar of the community, a successful businesswoman who had overcome the tragedy of losing her first husband to build a stable, prosperous life for her family. Learning that she had actually spent 15 years stealing from her orphaned daughter while presenting herself as a devoted mother was a level of hypocrisy that her friends and neighbors could not forgive. The country club where she and Marcus had been members for over 10 years asked them not to renew their membership. The charity organizations where my mother had volunteered quietly removed her from their boards and asked her not to attend future events. Even their church, where they had been regular attendees and generous contributors, made it clear that their presence was no longer welcome until they had made proper restitution for their theft. The financial pressure on both of them was mounting rapidly. The IRS liens meant they could not sell or refinance any of their properties without paying their full tax debt first, but they also could not generate income to pay those debts because their businesses had been destroyed. Marcus owed over $200,000 in back taxes and penalties, while the civil lawsuit I had filed was seeking $800,000 plus interest and legal fees. Their lawyer advised them that their only realistic option was to liquidate everything and hope they could avoid criminal prosecution by making full restitution. This meant selling the vacation house, the rental properties, their primary residence, and every luxury item they had purchased with my stolen inheritance. Even if they sold everything at market value, they would still owe more than they could pay, which meant they were facing personal bankruptcy in addition to potential prison time. The psychological impact of their fall was evident in how quickly they turned on each other. The stress of losing everything while facing criminal charges destroyed what was left of their relationship, and they began blaming each other for the decisions that had led to this disaster. Marcus claimed my mother had pressured him to use the trust fund money, and that he had only agreed because she convinced him I would never find out. My mother accused Marcus of being the mastermind behind the theft, and said she had only gone along with it because she was afraid of him. Their lawyers eventually advised them to avoid speaking to each other except through legal counsel because anything they said could be used against them in the criminal proceedings. The irony was perfect. They had destroyed their relationship with me over money, and now they were destroying their relationship with each other over the consequences of that choice. Meanwhile, I was discovering what it felt like to have people finally see the truth about what my family had really been like. For years, I had watched Marcus and my mother present themselves as generous, responsible adults, while privately treating me like an expensive burden they resented supporting. Now that the truth was public, I received an outpouring of support from people who had known them and were horrified to learn how they had really treated me. Former neighbors reached out to apologize for not recognizing the signs of what was happening. Co-workers of my mother contacted me to express their shock and offer support. Even people who barely knew me sent messages saying they could not believe anyone could treat their child the way Marcus and my mother had treated me. The validation was overwhelming in the best possible way. For so long I had been gaslit into believing that I was ungrateful or unreasonable for expecting them to help me when I needed it. Now I had hundreds of people confirming that their behavior had been absolutely unacceptable, and that I had every right to seek justice for what they had done to me. But the most meaningful support came from the former employees who had helped me build the case against Marcus. Jennifer, Robert, and Susan all told me that watching Marcus face consequences for his actions had given them closure for the way he had treated them. They said seeing him lose everything because of his greed and cruelty felt like justice for all the people he had cheated and manipulated over the years. The legal proceedings were moving forward exactly as my lawyer had predicted. The evidence was so overwhelming that Marcus and my mother's attorneys were already discussing plea agreements and settlement terms rather than trying to fight the charges. It was clear that they were going to lose everything, and the only question was whether they would also face prison time or just financial ruin and social disgrace. As I watched their world crumble around them, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went far beyond simple revenge. They had taught me that blood relations meant nothing when money was involved, so I had shown them what happened when someone with nothing left to lose decided to fight back with everything they had. 6 months after I had nearly died because my family told me I was not worth keeping alive, I sat in a courtroom watching Marcus and my mother accept a plea agreement that would change their lives forever. The federal judge was not impressed with their attempts to minimize their crimes, and the sentence reflected the serious nature of what they had done. Marcus received 3 years in federal prison for tax evasion and fraud, followed by 5 years of supervised probation during which he would be prohibited from operating any business without court approval. He would also be required to pay full restitution of $847,000, representing the principal amount they had stolen plus interest and penalties. The restitution order had priority over all their other debts, meaning I would be paid back before any other creditors could claim their assets. My mother avoided prison time by agreeing to cooperate fully with the investigation and forfeit all claims to the properties they had purchased with my trust fund money. However, she received 2 years of house arrest, 5 years of probation, and a permanent ban from working in real estate or any other profession requiring a fiduciary license. She would also be required to complete community service, specifically focused on helping families navigate medical financial crises, which seemed like appropriate cosmic justice. The civil settlement was even more comprehensive than I had hoped. Beyond recovering my stolen inheritance, I was awarded additional damages for emotional distress, punitive damages for their particularly cruel conduct, and all legal fees associated with the case. When everything was calculated and the properties were sold, I received over $1.2 million, significantly more than my trust fund would have been worth if they had never touched it. But the money, while important, was not the most meaningful part of my victory. The real satisfaction came from knowing that they would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of their choices while I moved forward with the security and opportunities my father had wanted me to have. The house where I had grown up, the vacation property in the mountains, and the rental properties that had provided them with passive income were all sold to pay their debts. Marcus and my mother were forced to move into a small apartment and take minimum wage jobs to survive experiencing financial insecurity for the first time in their adult lives. They finally understood what it felt like to worry about money and depend on others for basic necessities, something they had never had to experience because they had been living off my inheritance. Their social and professional rehabilitation would take years if it was even possible. Marcus's construction license was permanently revoked, and his conviction for federal fraud meant he would never be able to work in any industry requiring bonding or financial trust. My mother's real estate career was over, and her conviction would prevent her from working in banking, insurance, or any other field where she might handle other people's money. More importantly, everyone in our community now knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. There was no going back to their previous life of respected community members because too many people had seen the evidence of their crimes. They would carry the reputation of being people who stole from orphan children for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, I was discovering what it meant to have a real support system for the first time in my adult life. The people who had helped me through this ordeal had become the family I had never really had with Marcus and my mother. Daniel Martinez, the private investigator who had uncovered the evidence of their theft, stayed in touch and became a mentor who taught me about financial security and investment strategies. Thomas Richardson, my attorney, provided guidance not just on legal matters but on protecting myself from future manipulation. The former employees who had testified against Marcus became genuine friends who understood what it was like to be targeted by someone who used power and money to hurt people who threatened their control. Jennifer Walsh, who had been fired for asking questions about the financial discrepancies, was hired by a prestigious accounting firm after her role in exposing Marcus's crimes became public. Her courage in speaking up had cost her a job initially, but ultimately led to better opportunities with employers who valued integrity over blind loyalty. Robert Chen started his own construction company with several other former Marcus employees who had been mistreated over the years. They built their business on the principles of transparency and quality that Marcus had abandoned, and their reputation for honest dealing made them successful very quickly. Robert often told people that watching Marcus face consequences had inspired him to believe that doing the right thing really did matter in the long run. Susan Martinez was able to restart her accounting practice after cooperating with the investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing in Marcus's tax fraud. She specialized in helping small business owners set up proper financial controls to prevent the kind of systematic fraud she had been forced to facilitate under Marcus. Her experience had taught her how to recognize and prevent financial crimes, making her services valuable to clients who wanted to ensure their businesses were operated ethically and legally. I finished my senior year of college with the financial security I should have had all along, and graduated with highest honors in forensic accounting. The experience of uncovering Marcus and my mother's crimes had confirmed that I was extremely good at financial investigation, and I received job offers from several prestigious firms that specialized in fraud detection and asset recovery. But more than career success, I had learned important lessons about the difference between family and people who happen to share your genetics. Marcus and my mother had taught me that blood relationships mean nothing when they are not backed by genuine love and commitment. The people who had supported me through this crisis, who had believed in me when my own family had abandoned me, were my real family regardless of whether we shared DNA. I also learned that standing up for yourself, even when it feels impossible, is often the only way to prevent others from continuing to hurt you. If I had accepted their treatment and tried to maintain a relationship with them despite their refusal to help me during my medical emergency, they would have continued taking advantage of me for the rest of their lives. Fighting back had been scary and difficult, but it was the only way to break the cycle of manipulation and abuse. The most important lesson, though, was about the power of truth and persistence. Marcus and my mother had counted on me being too weak, too grateful, or too afraid to challenge them. They thought they could treat me however they wanted because I had no power to fight back, but they underestimated what someone could accomplish when they had nothing left to lose and access to the right resources and support. As I sat in that courtroom watching them accept responsibility for their crimes, I realized that this experience had taught me everything I needed to know about protecting myself and building a life based on genuine relationships rather than manipulation and fear. They had tried to destroy me to protect their stolen wealth, but instead they had created someone who was stronger, smarter, and more determined than they could ever be. Have you ever experienced family betrayal where money revealed people's true character? I never imagined the people who raised me could look me in the eye and tell me I was not worth keeping alive, but sometimes the biggest betrayals come from those we trust most. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on family loyalty versus personal greed, and let me know what you think justice should look like when family members steal from each other. If this story resonated with you or taught you something about standing up for yourself, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding your chosen family. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that fighting back against manipulation is not just acceptable, it is necessary. Thank you for listening to my story and supporting my journey from victim to survivor. Remember that your worth is never determined by how others choose to treat you. And sometimes the family that truly matters is the one you build yourself through shared values and genuine care. Keep fighting for what you deserve, and never let anyone convince you that you are not worth protecting and defending.